So, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. Now, brethren, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to him, we ask you, not to be soon shaken in mind or troubled either by spirit or by word or by letter, as if from us, as though the day of Christ had come. Let no one deceive you by any means. And Flo talked about this and pointed this out. The second coming had not yet occurred at this point in time. And that's what Paul was trying to tell the church. Some were troubled about that for whatever reason. First Thessalonians, they were troubled about what happens to those who have died when the Lord comes again, and what happens to us. And Paul explains all that. And then seemingly, as we said as we started 2 Thessalonians, for some reason he had to repeat what he said about that. Maybe they didn't get the message, or it was just important enough for him to stress one more time in the second letter that he sent to them about what was going to happen at the second coming. And basically the summary of that entire thing and the summary of these books all together is very simple. Don't worry about it. God's got it covered. And that's what I think Paul's trying to say with all of these things that we're looking at here in our discussion. So we move on then. This is the slide Flo used last week. Said that day will not come until the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition. And again, we pointed out the key verse in verse 5 that he had said, I've already told you this once. I've said this before. This is not anything new. You've heard this before, but I told you these things while I was with you. And so they had heard this before. But somehow, again, I don't know what the problem was, but it may be that those who were teaching something different than that were strong teachers, gifted teachers, able to present their idea in a way that, even though it contrasted with what Paul had said, that maybe people were troubled about that. And maybe you've been in that situation where you've been in a place where somebody got up and started preaching something that was different than what you knew, that you believed, that you were comfortable with, and yet they did it in such a way that it made you think, could they be right? Could that be true? And I think I've used this story before in this class, but I can remember one time in a gathering back in Oklahoma City. It was one of those big area-wide gatherings in downtown theater of some kind, and the speaker got up, and he was one of those speakers who was just dynamic, was good, and you just enjoyed listening to him. The trouble was, about halfway through the lesson, kind of hit to the point where we were looking at each other and saying, how did we get here? Because we shouldn't be here. But he was such a powerful speaker that he kind of led us down the primrose path, so to speak, and until all of a sudden he hit a point where he said, oh, wait a minute, something's wrong with this. And had to rethink all of that. So maybe that's what was happening with the people in Thessalonica. They were troubled by it because it sounded plausible maybe. It sounded like maybe this could be something that we need to think about. And so Paul is again reiterating, he hasn't come. There's going to be some things that have to happen. And again, Flo talked about some of this in his class last week. The falling away, the word there is apostasia, and we transliterate that to apostasy and use that word, but it's basically the falling away. What does apostasy suggest to you? Ellen?
Someone who missed the boat.
Okay, somebody who missed the boat. It's interesting that it's a falling away, which means they were somewhere where they should have been, and then they fall away. So this is not something that applies to the whole world. It's applying to people who are in the church, who are faithful to Christ, and then for some reason that they fall away. And it's interesting, this is not the only place where warnings about that are given in Scripture. I do not pray that you should take them out of the world, but you should keep them from the evil one. That was Jesus' prayer, John chapter 17 and verse 15. He knew they would have issues, and he knew the devil would be on guard against them and working against them. And he said, I'm not praying you take them out of the world, but just keep them from that evil one. And so there was a knowledge in Jesus' mind that there would be trouble at some point. Matthew 7, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Even so, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear fruit is cut down, and thrown into the fire. Therefore, by their fruits you will know them. So again, there's that warning. False teachers, they're out there, and they're going to be a part of the church from that point on. And we still have to deal with that in the world today. Acts 20. Therefore take heed to yourselves and to all the flock among which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to shepherd the church of God, which he purchased with his own blood. For I know this, that after my departure savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. Also from among yourselves men will rise up speaking perverse things to draw away disciples after themselves. And so that issue again over and over and over repeated. 2 Corinthians 11. But what I do, I will also continue to do, that I may cut off the opportunity from those who desire an opportunity to be regarded just as we are in the things of which they boast. For such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into the apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for Satan himself transforms himself into an angel of light. 2 Timothy 3. But I know this, that in the last days perilous times will come. For men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness, but denying its power, and from such people turn away. Titus 1, for there are many insubordinate, both idle talkers and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision, whose mouths must be stopped, who subvert whole households, teaching things which they ought not for the sake of dishonest gain. One of them, a prophet of their own, says, Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons. This testimony is true, therefore rebuke them sharply, that they may be sound in the faith, not giving heed to Jewish fables and commandments of men who turn from the truth. To the pure all things are pure, but to those who are defiled and unbelieving nothing is pure, and even their minds and consciences are defiled. They profess to know God, but in works they deny him, being abominable, disobedient, and disqualified in every good work. 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 1 and 2. There are also false prophets among the people, even as there will be false teachers among you, who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the Lord who bought them, and bring to them swift destruction, and many will follow their destructive ways, because of whom the way of truth will be blasphemed. Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits, whether they are of God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. I wrote to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to have preeminence among them, does not receive us. Therefore, if I come, I will call to mind his deeds, which he does, prating against us with malicious words. And not content with that, he himself does not receive the brethren, and forbids those who wish to, putting them out of the church. And again, that's quite a list of scriptures that talk about that throughout the pages of the New Testament and give warning to that. What do you think's behind the mindset of these false teachers and false prophets that he's talking about? Why do you think they took the gospel as Paul preached it, or Peter, or whomever, and changed it and subverted it? What's behind that, do you think?
Their own good.
Okay, their own good. They're doing it for selfish purposes, Ellen?
Yeah, exactly. They're looking to take the power away.
Okay.
That way they can subvert it. And it was also said that we'll also have preachers, demons preaching from the pulpit. So you have people that are listening to that and believing it. Like you said, you take some of the preachers like Joel Osteen, for example. He started out, everybody thought, wow, this guy is really great. Now he's got a $75 million yacht, but at the expense of his.
Yeah. So it's a personal issue with these people. What word would you use for that? Maybe one of two. Pride, arrogance, of thinking that my way is a better way than what Paul taught. And Paul said to the Galatian brethren, if we preach to you anything, we or an angel preach to you anything other than what you've been preached to, or what you had preached to you, what was the end result of that? Paul said, let him be accursed, right? So that was a harsh statement to make, but he said the gospel's been preached, don't change it, don't adapt it. And so these people, for whatever reason, or maybe in their pride, or they think they're overly smart. I can remember when I got a school learning to be a preacher, I knew everything. And until about a week in the job, I realized I didn't know very much at all. But people get that idea that I know things, I know better things, I know more things than you. And we get puffed up in our pride and our arrogance because we think we've got something. And again, what was one of was it against Corinth? All they want to do is hear something new. And maybe that's part of the problem. Here's the gospel that's preached and preached and preached. I wonder how many sermons you've heard in your time as a Christian. I mean, I can't even begin to count how many I've probably heard during my lifetime within the church. And I'm saying this to make a point. It's just the same old stuff over and over again, isn't it? Same old gospel over and over again. How might that play into this idea of false teachers here? Marcia?
Well, unfortunately, people put a lot of those on pedestals. And then they start thinking, because they're human, they start thinking that they're greater than they are. And then money comes in, which the Bible tells us is huge evil. And they just fall completely out of God's life.
Sure. Fall out under the sway because they've been elevated and enjoy that position of authority, and it affects them.
Well, another thing too is you look at the other churches around us where you're saved by faith alone. You don't have to be baptized. All you do is ask Jesus into your heart. And it's amazing to me to drive around the city here and look at the different churches and see their parking lots full to the brim. And you're thinking to yourself, these are Christians.
Yeah. And part of it is there are some things that are hard in the gospel, aren't there? Hard to live up to, hard to do. And isn't it just easier to kind of not worry about those things? Kind of skip over that passage that's one I don't want to listen to because I can make my life easier by not doing that, or by doing that, or whatever the case may be with that. And again, that's why I think, and I was getting to around, if we allow it to, we can let the gospel become boring to us, can't it? It's, you hear it over and over again, and if you're not engaging with it and not continually studying it, learning it, it can come to the point, I've heard so many sermons on baptism, why don't we preach about something else? I've heard so many sermons about the Lord's Supper, why don't we preach about something else? Let's do something different and new. John?
The whole idea, too, that we're going to hear about, well, things have changed a whole lot since those days.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things now that weren't there then, and this has got to be a living document. It's really,
Yeah. Yeah, John makes a good point that a lot of people look at it as, well, that was fine for first century world, fine for those people back then, but the world has changed. Things are different, and therefore the gospel has to keep up with the modern world and all the things in the modern world. How would you respond to that? Oh, go ahead, Bob.
Well, just backtracking a little bit. The search for something new and interesting can lead us into sermons that are the equivalent of discussing how many angels will fit on the head of a pin, completely irrelevant to our walk with God.
Sure.
Sometimes we just need that over and over again. We may go, yeah, I'm bored, but it's kind of like your mom telling you to pick up your room. Eventually, you'll get around to it.
Yeah, Bob makes a good point that that this desire to have something new can lead us to irrelevant things, discussions that don't have a purpose or don't matter in the discussion. How many angels can dance on the head of a pin? Who knows? Who cares? I mean, what difference would that make? Lessen than flow.
You asked the question, how would you respond with the fact that the world has changed? I think, yeah, I agree with that. It's changed for the worse in most cases. What the Ebonites tell us about himself, he's the same today, yesterday. He hasn't changed. So why would what he asked us to do change?
Okay, Les makes the good point that God doesn't change, and as a result of the fact he doesn't change, he's still the same today as he was when all this was written back in the first century. And so, yes, the world changes, but really, are there any different sins now than there were in the first century?
Not according to Solomon.
Not according to Solomon, yeah. It's everything stays the same. It's nothing new under the sun. And so, yes, it may be they didn't have computer pornography in the first century. But that's a change of technology. Did they have lust? Did they have adultery? Well, yeah, fornication, all that was there. The basic thing is there. It's just packaged differently in the world in which we live today. And that's, again, when we think about the false teachers and bringing that up and bringing that in because it's popular now. It's accepted now. And society accepting it is not a good measure of whether we should accept it or not. It's whether or not God accepts it. That's the standard. Flo, you had a comment.
Just to follow up on Les, God is consistent. The gospel doesn't change. The truth doesn't change. We and man compromise the truth constantly. So I always have to put myself in Thessalonians' shoes, because if I don't, I might be doing the same thing down the road. So we're human, Marcia said. We're going to have some weaknesses. We're going to get lazy. We're going to become complacent in our Christian lives. And when that happens, that's when the teachers and the false teachers and those that have offenders coming into the church will cause us to start second-guessing ourselves. Not because we're bad people, it's because sometimes we can fall into those traps. Because, like you were saying, teaching can be boring. So I don't think it's boring, it's just that we just become complacent to it.
Yeah.
And it's almost like taking it for granted. And once we start taking our lives for granted as Christians, and walking Jesus' footsteps every day, we will fall just like the Thessalonians did.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's and again, it boils down to Kevin keeping engaged with the Word, and each of us individually keeping engaged with the Word so that it doesn't become just that repetitive, boring thing that we don't get anything out of. Sometimes you have to work at it. in order to find something that's going to encourage you in that. And yes, we need to be told over and over and over again. That's a good thing. Repetition is, I think, necessary. I mean, when you were learning your ABCs and when you were learning to do math, what did you do? You did it over and over and over and over and over and over again. But what happened? You got it, and it stayed with you. Because I'm sure all of you can still sing your ABC songs that you learned on that, because it's something that stayed with us. Sherry?
The other thing, especially when we look at today's culture, society, people are drawn to all of these churches who now preach acceptance. You know, they only want to go if they're going to hear about the love of God, the love of Christ. Oh, and you know, and then they turn it back. How can you say you're a Christian but yet preach hate, not preaching hate? That they see it that way. If we say certain lifestyles are a sin, but you know that so many churches, and you know we're hearing just around different, you know, different places that even those ideas coming into the Church of Christ, you know, wanting to be more accepted and growing, so they're not preaching on certain things. Let's just avoid it. That way we don't have to deal with it.
Don't make anybody mad.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Bob.
Well, and part of all of this becomes a draw to charismatic type preachers.
Yeah.
Saw a story on TV this morning when I was getting ready about what's his name,
Holstein.
Yeah. Having a big gospel deal at Yankee Stadium, filled 2/3 of the stadium. Of course, the story didn't have a word about what he preached, but that they filled the 2/3 of that stadium coming to hear him preach. And that's probably the biggest thing, the biggest detriment, when we're always looking for something new and shiny, instead of coming back to what's simple and what's right. And I believe God didn't make the Bible complicated. He really summed it up in the greatest commandment. To me, everything else is a supporting text in the Bible. Interesting, but always having to stay focused on that one thing.
Yeah, Bob makes a good point that he wrote the Bible in such a way that it's not complicated, it's not hard, it's not difficult to figure out. Yes, there are a few hard passages in there that we struggle with sometimes, but for the most part, it's understandable. And again, that ease of understanding can lead us to that complacency again if we don't keep interacting and working with that word every day. All right, other thoughts, comments, Diana.
The best way I want to say this: Paul tells us not to lose sight, and also don't lose your faith. Not to say that we shouldn't grow the church in particular. For me, I guess I was overwhelmed. I went to, in my younger years, I went to a singles retreat. There were people coming from everywhere, from the Bahamas, from California, whatever. You don't realize that there are small seeds of the Church of Christ setting in different locations. And when you see it as one big group or large, you don't even understand the magnitude of it. And so, yes, when we do pass some churches, not saying all, they may not have the interconnection. It may just be Joe Osteen by himself, and I'm just going to do another church over here. But there's not multitudes of those. So when you see his in one big lump, it looks extraordinarily large. But when you see it brought together for the Church of Christ that's here, and Oklahoma, and Washington, and Georgia, and places of the world that we have no idea, you realize that that small mustard seed is setting in every location. But we're seeing it saying, okay, this is what we are. So he says, don't lose faith, just keep going. Because there's much more of you out there. And God's not going to lose his battle. It's going to be a winning battle.
Yeah, exactly. Diana makes the good point that it's not just us here at Pikes Peak. There are churches all over the country, churches all over the world, all over the state, people who have the same faith that we have, that are talking about the same things we talk about, that right now are worshiping or having Bible class depending on the time frame and where they are. And that should be heartening. I think we back up in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians where Paul tells of them, we brag about you to other churches because of what you're doing. And we've got to keep that in mind with all the issues and problems they're having there, that they were still doing a good job. They were just having those, I guess, growing pains or whatever you want to call them. And Paul was dealing with those, but they were a good church, and their story was encouraging to others, just as we have visiting speakers come in and talk about mission works that are going on here and there, and we're encouraged by the fact that the good word is going out somewhere in Ghana or in Nigeria or somewhere here in the United States. We like that because we know that faith is growing, not just here, but everywhere. And that should be, I think, encouraging to all of us in that regard. All right, anything else? Flo?
Well, the key scripture here is the one we read in 2 Timothy and Ellen read last week. You look at those terrible things that he talks about.
Yeah.
If Flo becomes a lover of money, if I'm proud, abusive, boastful, if I pretend to be a form of godliness and I don't practice it, that's me. It could be me, unless I practice and at least try to be what God wants me to be.
Yeah.
And it will be no different than Thessalonians or any other generation since then.
Right.
In the church.
Absolutely. And again, it boils down to what you say. Me staying with the Word, staying in the faith, and staying faithful to the faith in that regard. Went ahead and advanced the slide. Some of the things that we know from 1st, 2nd century as far as what we would call apostasies. Again, the direct article here is the apostasia. So it's some event. And it's hard to pinpoint what that event was, or which one, what he's talking about there. Gnosticism, God is good and perfect but unknowable. The world was created by a lesser deity, therefore that's why he explains all of its flaws. And in order to be close to God, you acquire the special mystical knowledge that allows us to know God. And that had its roots in first century world. It didn't come into really as much into prominence till 2nd and 3rd century, but it was one of those things that were troubling to the church at that time. It was a group called the Ebonites, and their basic idea was, well, Jesus was Messiah, but he wasn't God. And why is that a big deal?
That's one of our primary doctrines.
Okay.
That God came in the flesh.
Yeah. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And verse 14, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld as of the only begotten Lord, to the glory of God the Father. If I'm getting that, not butchering it too bad. So they accepted Jesus as Messiah, but denied he was God, and so that was a wrinkle there. Judaizers, obviously, we read about them all throughout the book of Acts and in several other places. Christianity, basically, their mindset was Christianity was a sect of the Jews. In order to be a Christian, you had to become a Jew. And Paul argues about that over and over and over again. We know that's not Nicolaitans are mentioned specifically in the text. They encouraged God's people to follow sexual pleasures and idolatry, as did Balaam of old. And so that was a thing they were dealing with. If you look back at our history, especially with our fellowship, those pioneer preachers from the 1800s and early 1900s, almost all of them will make the argument that what he's talking about here is the Roman Catholic Church. And you can make it all fit, but then you can make it all fit with some of these other things too. And so what I told Flo didn't finish this, which I was hoping he would, so we wouldn't have to go through it, but I think he did that on purpose. So,
Stay home, man.
yeah. And so, because it's one of those things where I would like to have a clear answer of what exactly he was talking about, but I can't seem to find that clear answer. But the way he's writing to the church of Thessalonica, it was something they would see. I think Mike made that comment last week in class. It was something they would see and know, something that they would say, okay, that's what he's talking about here. And what that was, again, that's kind of hard for us to understand. You say something, Mike?
You said it.
Okay. All right. So anyway, for us, whatever this was, whatever that apostasy was, how does it affect us personally or as a church? Well, if we're faithful, it doesn't. Go ahead, Les.
I think we need to keep in mind the big mistake that Eve made and that Adam made afterwards. Anything that God says is true. Sometimes we have a hard time understanding and interpreting it right. But when it comes from the mouth of a man or an individual, we need to understand that it could be wrong. It could be a deception, and we need to make a strong comparison to what is being said and what God has told us is the truth.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So it's, again, whatever happened, whatever he was talking about with the church in Thessalonica, and whatever they took that to mean and understood that to mean, we fast forward to this year, to today, and there can still be apostasy. There can still be a falling away, individuals, churches, or whatever. And so that hasn't changed, but the basic premise is still the same. Stick with the Word, follow the Word, and you'll avoid these types of doctrines. And we talked about the 80-70 theory that a lot of people have believed in, that Jesus' second coming was at the destruction of the temple in AD 70. And we talked about how that didn't seem to fit and mesh with Scripture several weeks ago as we looked through that. But those things can come up, and we've got to be on guard against them. And again, maybe I can remember, hadn't been preaching too terribly long, and kind of ran into a group of people. I won't mention the name of the particular school where they went, but their entire preaching career was spent, as one of my members back in Sayers said, beating the boogers out of the bushes. That's all they did. It was all about false teaching and all that, and that was they were passionate about it. And so every Sunday it was about some false teaching within the church and all of that. And not saying we shouldn't preach on that, we shouldn't teach on that, but when that becomes the sum total of your preaching, you're missing out on a whole bunch of other stuff in there as well. And so we have to be on guard. We have to stay on top of things. But as long as we're in the Word, it's less likely that we're going to fall for those things than if we don't stay in the Word. Because if I'm uninformed, it's easier for somebody to spread doubt in my mind if I haven't worked through that and studied it and kind of, as we say, owned it in my own life. So again, whatever that falling away was, whatever you want to look at it, it's not something we have to worry about today per se in our lifetimes, but we do have to worry about apostasy. Ellen?
Yeah, and that's another thing that's really important too, is our relationship with one another. Because we can read the Bible. In fact, I know a couple of people, they don't go to church at all, but they read the Bible and they believe that they're saved because they were in a church at one time and no longer are, because they were so upset with the people or whatever. But I think that one of the things that helped with Thessalonians was the fact that they had each other. They heard Paul, they heard the Word, they understood, and they were like the opinion of like us, we're not changing. This is what God's saying, that's what we're going to do. And some people said, well, that's your belief. I'm going to follow this way.
Yeah. And so again, it's all about the Word. We've been told, we've been given everything we need for life and godliness through the knowledge of Jesus. So we have everything we need. And so we've got to follow that, which we have, so we don't end up doing something that God doesn't approve of. And so that's kind of the whole thing for this church in Thessalonica. They were dealing with that. Paul was trying to keep them on, as we call it, straight and narrow. And that's why he wrote to them a second time about all of these things, so that they would have that reinforcing knowledge and reinforcing push from Paul about what they should and should not be doing in their life. It talks about the man of sin, or this also calls him the son of perdition. Judas was called that. John 17, verse 12. So that gives you an indication of what Paul's mindset was in this. Judas was called that. It says there, he opposes God. He exalts self above all that is called God or all that is worshipped, verse 4. So that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. He's called the lawless one. And according to the working of Satan, with all power, signs, and lying wonders, with all unrighteous deception. So those are how Paul describes this man of perdition. And again, I was hoping Flo was going to tell us who that was in his class last week, and he didn't get to that. But I think the problem with that is probably lots of sons of perdition. But he's talking about something specifically here that the Thessalonians would understand and would know when the time came or who this person was. They would get that. They would grasp that. But again, anybody can be a man of sin or a son of perdition by doing those things that Paul talks about right here in this section. At the time of the writing, it says he was restrained. Okay? Said it'll be revealed in his own time. But here's the thing, is already at work, verse 7. So this wasn't something that they were looking forward to necessarily, but it was something that was already going on within maybe the church of Thessalonica or churches elsewhere. Again, we don't know who this was or what it was, but it was already going on at that time. And so there are a lot of people, I think, look at this passage and say, well, let's start looking for who the son of perdition is. And maybe we find somebody in our lifetime that we think fits that bill. And so you make that son of perdition when, well, maybe they are a son of perdition. Maybe they are a man of sin. But tying it back to 2 Thessalonians is probably not a very good idea, because that would take it way out of the context of what we're talking about here. The Lord will consume him with the breath of his mouth and destroy, notice what it says, with the brightness of his coming. So this is going to go on until he comes, when the Son of Man, the man of sin, son of perdition, will be destroyed along with all evildoers in that context. All right? Verses 10 through 12. Among those who perish because they did not receive the love of the truth, that they might be saved, and for this reason God will send them strong delusion, that they should believe the lie, that they may be condemned who did not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. So again, they perish. Why? Because they did not receive the true love of the truth, that they might be saved. And notice it says that interesting, and I'm not sure what to make of that. They did not receive the love of the truth. Now that's different, isn't it? If we were to say they did not receive the truth, that's different than did not receive the love of the truth. How is it different? Or am I wrong with that?
Well, for example, if anybody studied with Mormons or Seventh-day Adventists or Jehovah's Witnesses, you can talk to you blue in the face to them sometimes, because they do not want to know the truth. They want to know what they were taught, and they use certain scriptures to prove their point. So you say to yourself, well, it's just like when you go someplace and they don't want to listen to you, you shake the dust off your feet and you go your way. But when they're your close friends, it really becomes obvious.
Yeah, it's a hard thing to do. Receiving the love of the truth. I mean, there's a lot of truth out there, isn't there? I'm not talking just religious truth. There's a lot of truth out there. Some of it we just take for granted. We don't think about it. But when we think about the love of the truth, the passion for the truth, that seems to be, at least in my mind, what Paul is saying here. The church, you need to have a love of that truth. You need to receive and hold on to the love of that truth. You love it because it's the way that will get you to heaven. And that's, to me, that I think, in my own personal opinion, that was a very specific thing that Paul chose to say, rather than just say they didn't receive the truth, but they didn't receive the love of the truth. in that context. All right, thoughts, comments, questions, Flo?
You know, my study was, and I was raised this, that Paul talks about the son of perdition, and he says it's here. You know, it's kind of a scary thing, because if you look at the scriptures of what, at the end of time, before Jesus comes, this individual, whatever it is, identified, that it's here now.
Yeah.
We got to look at it from not then, but today. It's here now,
Yeah.
even though it hasn't been identified, but Jesus comes, and that's going to happen. And the one that really gave me some trouble with the scripture right here was that God sent him a strong delusion. And I think what it's saying is at that time, the ones that have totally been in apostasy, given up on God or don't believe it anymore, I think that delusion is saying that at that time, God's going to give up on them.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Giving up on them right now.
Flo makes a point that this is going on still. This was going on then, and it's going on still. And there are people who have gotten so far from the truth that they just don't want it anymore. They'll just believe the lie. They won't care about the truth. They won't care about the love of the truth. They'll believe a lie and be condemned as a result of that. And that could be us if we're not careful in our study of the Scriptures. All right, well, we're out of time. I appreciate all your comments this morning, and we'll close out class for now and pick up there, Lord willing, next week.